Welcome back, seekers of truth and forgotten rituals. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and ring the bell, because tonight we're going to uncover one of the oldest, strangest, and most censored stories in human history. The story of a plant that connected people to the divine, before it was turned into sin. For thousands of years, long before marijuana became a word of controversy, humans burned herbs to speak to gods. They inhaled smoke, not for pleasure, but for revelation. It wasn't about getting high. It was about getting closer. Our story begins not in the 20th century, but 5,000 years ago in a temple buried beneath the sands of ancient China. Archaeologists discovered small bowls, blackened by fire, containing traces of cannabis, not grown for rope, not for cloth, but for ceremony. In those days, the plant was called ma, the hemp of the gods. Shamans of the Yangshao and Scythian tribes burned it to open the Heaven's Gate, a state between waking and dream where they believed the soul could leave the body. To them, smoke wasn't pollution, it was prayer. Far to the west, in ancient India, cannabis had another name, bhang. In the Vedas it was called the sacred grass that frees the mind. Priests of Shiva drank it mixed with milk and honey, saying it allowed them to see truth without fear. Even the gods, they said, used it to rest their minds after creating the world. One passage calls it the giver of joy, the liberator. So when you imagine people in ancient India, under sacred banyan trees, chanting as sweet smoke rose to the sky, you're not far from the truth. It was divine. It was holy. And no one thought it was wrong. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, Hebrew texts mention a mysterious plant used in sacred oil, cannabis. For centuries, scholars translated it as calamus. But some linguists now argue it was actually cannabis. If true, that would mean the anointing oil described in the Old Testament contained the very plant that modern laws once called a narcotic. Imagine it. Moses, priests, prophets, all anointed in oil that carried the scent of the same herb, now criminalized in nearly every country for centuries. It wasn't rebellion, it was ritual. By the time the ancient Greeks arrived, cannabis had already traveled the Silk Road. Herodotus, the father of history, described the Scythians, fierce warriors who celebrated death with smoke-filled tents. They would throw hemp seeds onto red-hot stones and rejoice in the vapor. Even then, the idea of sacred intoxication existed, not as indulgence, but as purification, a journey inward through smoke to remember what lay beyond flesh. So what changed? How did a plant once used to crown kings and anoint priests become a forbidden leaf that could send you to prison? The answer, as always, begins with power. When Rome conquered the ancient world, it didn't just seize land, it seized symbols. The empire inherited every ritual, every god, and slowly decided which ones would live and which would burn. And when Christianity rose from Rome's ashes, it brought with it a new kind of law, one that didn't just rule behavior, but the mind itself. To the early church, anything that promised direct communion with the divine, without a priest, without a ritual approved by Rome, was dangerous. Because if a farmer or shepherd could talk to God through a plant, what need was there for bishops? Cannabis, mushrooms, mandrake, all the old plants of wisdom, were quietly recast as tools of witchcraft. They were not holy anymore. They were demonic. By the time of the Middle Ages, the world that once saw smoke as prayer now saw it as sin. Women who brewed healing potions were accused of summoning spirits. Herbalists who used cannabis for childbirth pain were called witches. And when the Inquisition began, thousands were burned, not for worshiping Satan, but for remembering the old ways. A world that once believed plants were gifts from God was now taught that the earth itself could tempt you to hell. The irony. Even as priests condemned the smoke of hemp, they burned incense, sometimes from the same families of plants. The church said only their smoke was holy. Only their trance was divine. Control the ritual, control the people. And so the plant that once opened minds became the symbol of rebellion. But it didn't die. It went underground, hidden in folk medicine, secret prayers, and distant cultures untouched by Rome. It would take centuries, oceans, and empires to silence the leaf completely. And when it returned, it would come back stronger. In the next part of our journey, we'll travel through Africa, the Islamic world, and the Americas to see how cannabis became both medicine and weapon, holy and cursed, sacred and criminal. Because the story of this plant is not just about getting high. It's about who gets to define what divine means. When the old world burned, its smoke did not vanish. It traveled. Across deserts, across oceans, carried by wanderers, healers, and slaves. Wherever people went, the sacred leaf went with them. But in the age of conquest, even smoke could be chained. In ancient Africa, cannabis was not sin, it was spirit. Among the Bantu and the Zulu, it was burned before battle and childbirth alike. Tribes in the Congo called it the plant that opens the road, used to bless travelers and to speak with ancestors before long journeys. In Ethiopia, priests of the ancient Ethiopian church, far older than Rome's empire, burned hemp with frankincense during secret night masses. They said the smoke carried prayers faster than words. No one yet called it weed. It was still medicine for the soul. But when Islam spread across North Africa and the Middle East, the plant took on new meaning. The Quran never mentioned cannabis directly, yet Sufi mystics saw in it the same gateway to divine ecstasy their ancestors had known. They didn't smoke to escape reality. They smoked to dissolve the wall between the seen and the unseen. In the 13th century, travelers wrote of Sufi dervishes sitting in silence, eyes half closed, the air thick with the sweet scent of hemp. They believed it opened the eye of the heart. They called it hashish. To them, it was not vice. It was vision. But as with all things that free the mind, authority soon followed, and feared. By the time the Ottoman Empire rose, hashish had become a symbol of the poor, the outsider, the mystic, those who did not bow to the Sultan's rigid order. And so, edicts began to appear. Bans, punishments, prisons. The same plant that helped the devout find God was now seen as the mark of heretics. It was a pattern humanity could never stop repeating. What begins as revelation ends as rebellion, and rebellion must always be controlled. Across the ocean, far from mosques and monasteries, another world was about to meet the plant. When Spanish and Portuguese ships reached the shores of the New World, they brought more than faith and fire. They brought seeds. Hemp was valuable to empires, for ropes, sails, oil. So it was planted everywhere. Brazil, Mexico, Peru. But with those industrial crops came something else, the memory of the sacred. African slaves, forced onto plantations, recognized the leaves immediately. In secret, they revived the old rituals, rolling the leaves into tight balls, burning them in hidden fires, calling on their gods, not their masters. For them, cannabis was not recreation. It was rebellion disguised as prayer. They whispered its names in Kikongo and Yoruba. To the slave owner, it was nothing but a weed. To the enslaved, it was freedom that couldn't be whipped away. In the Caribbean, runaway slaves known as the Maroons built villages deep in the mountains of Jamaica. There, they grew the sacred herb, smoked it before battles, and believed the smoke hid them from their enemies. Centuries later, those same mountains would become the birthplace of Rastafari. The flame of Africa reborn under a new name. But long before dreadlocks and reggae, there was silence and smoke and the memory of gods who had not abandoned them. Meanwhile, in Europe, the Church's stance hardened. The Reformation and the Counter-Reformation left Rome paranoid. Every new idea, every unapproved ritual was seen as a threat. So, when travelers returned from the East speaking of hashish, when explorers described tribes using sacred hemp, the Church and the Crown labeled it all the same way: pagan. In one letter from 1571, a Spanish bishop in Mexico warned, "The natives burn a plant to summon spirits. It makes them laugh without reason. The devil hides in the leaf." And that was enough. From then on, smoke was no longer sacred. It was suspicious. No longer prayer, but sin. And by the dawn of the 1600s, the age of fire was over. The age of prisons had begun. Yet, the truth has a way of escaping. Even as Europe banned the leaf, doctors began studying it again, quietly. Paracelsus, the rebel physician, wrote that every plant is divine, though man knows it not. In India, British soldiers discovered bhang festivals and sent reports home of men who laugh at death. Science was curious. Religion was afraid. And between them stood the leaf, silent, green, ancient. By the 18th century, Europe's scientists had rediscovered almost everything the ancients knew. That cannabis could ease pain, stop nausea, calm the mind. But even as it healed, it still carried a curse, the scent of rebellion, of the East, of people who refused to obey. And as the empire expanded, that scent became an excuse for control. Because you can conquer land, but you can't conquer a mind that knows its own freedom. So when the British Empire began ruling India, they tolerated bhang, but feared it. They taxed it, studied it, debated it. In 1894, the Indian Hemp Drugs Commission concluded something remarkable. Cannabis does not produce violence nor crime. It brings peace. The report was buried, ignored, and forgotten, because peace, real peace, is bad for business. By the end of the 19th century, one truth had become clear. The leaf survived everything. Empires rose and fell. Priests changed robes. Laws changed names. But the smoke kept rising, from India to Africa, from Sufi shrines to Caribbean hills. Each puff a quiet act of remembrance, each flame a spark against forgetting. And in the next part, that spark will meet the modern world, where propaganda, fear, and profit would transform a sacred herb into public enemy number one. Because to erase a ritual, you must first invent a demon. By the dawn of the 20th century, the world had changed. Empires had fallen, science had risen, and the Church no longer ruled the human soul, at least not alone. But the old instinct to control what frees the mind, that never died. It simply changed uniforms. Where bishops once burned witches, bureaucrats now burned books. Where priests once condemned heresy, politicians condemned pleasure. And in that new theater of fear, the ancient green leaf was cast as the villain. It began in America. The same country that called itself the land of the free needed a new enemy to justify control. Cannabis had been part of everyday life, used in medicine, rope, oil, even as a common painkiller sold in pharmacies. No one feared it, until someone realized fear could be profitable. Enter the new church of the 20th century, industry. Paper barons, oil tycoons, and chemical corporations, men like William Randolph Hearst and DuPont, saw hemp as competition. It could make cheaper paper than wood, cleaner fuel than oil, stronger cloth than cotton. So they did what every empire does when truth threatens profit. They told a story. In 1930, a man named Harry Anslinger became the first head of the U.S. Federal Bureau of Narcotics. He needed a crusade, and cannabis, once known as Indian hemp, became his chosen devil. He didn't call it hemp anymore. He called it marijuana. A foreign word, exotic, frightening, foreign enough to make people afraid of their neighbors. Anslinger's reports were filled with lies that sounded like sermons. Marijuana causes insanity. It makes white women crave black men. It turns normal men into killers. And the newspapers, owned by Hearst, printed every word. Soon, the country was in moral panic. Movies like Reefer Madness showed teenagers going insane from a single puff. Churches warned that cannabis opened the door to Satan. Politicians thundered that the nation must protect its youth. But the truth? The war wasn't against a plant. It was against the people who used it, the poor, the black, the brown, the rebellious. Smoke had always been prayer for the oppressed, and the powerful never forgave that. By 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act made possession a crime. Doctors protested, scientists objected. Even the American Medical Association testified that the ban was absurd. But no one listened. The law passed. The plant became contraband. And in the eyes of the new empire, the United States, the same herb once burned in temples now belonged in the fire of prisons. When World War II began, the hypocrisy became almost divine. The U.S. secretly encouraged farmers to grow hemp again. They called it hemp for victory. They needed rope for ships, canvas for uniforms, oil for engines. But the moment the war ended, the truth was buried again. The fields were cut down. The silence returned. Then came the 1960s, the decade of rebellion. Young people searching for meaning beyond war and conformity rediscovered the ancient leaf. They called it peace. They called it love. They called it freedom. But to the government, it looked too much like the past, like Sufis in the desert, like witches by firelight, like slaves praying in smoke. And so the Church of Control, now dressed as the state, declared a new crusade, the war on drugs. In 1971, President Richard Nixon stood before America and said, "Drugs are public enemy number one." But his aide, John Ehrlichman, later confessed the truth decades later. We couldn't make it illegal to be black or anti-war, but by associating the hippies with marijuana and the blacks with heroin, we could criminalize both communities. The confession came too late. Millions were already behind bars. The war on a plant had become a war on people. In those years, cannabis became both forbidden fruit and sacred symbol again. Musicians sang about it. Writers defended it. Mystics used it to meditate. It was, once again, the same fire, the spark of knowledge that power could not tolerate. Because cannabis didn't just calm pain, it made people question. It made them ask, why is this banned? Who decided? What are they afraid of? And that, as it had always been, was the real danger. But the story didn't end there. The same governments that called it evil soon learned something awkward. The plant healed. Doctors rediscovered its medical power, easing cancer pain, epilepsy, anxiety. Scientists found compounds that worked better than synthetic drugs. And the lie began to crumble. By the 1990s, people whispered the unthinkable. Perhaps the ancient shamans, priests, and mystics had been right all along. The sacred smoke was not the devil's breath. It was medicine. It was memory. It was freedom. And yet, even today, in many parts of the world, people still rot in prison for burning the same leaf that once crowned kings. History has a strange sense of irony. The plant humanity used to meet God was turned into a tool of punishment. And now, centuries later, it is once again the key to healing the human mind. But how did that transformation truly happen? How did governments rewrite the very idea of sin and salvation in the modern age, replacing religion with propaganda, confession with surveillance, and incense with tear gas? That, my friend, is where our journey continues. Because the war on cannabis was never about health. It was about obedience. By the time the 21st century began, the war on cannabis had already lasted longer than most empires. It had jailed millions, silenced scientists, and rewritten morality for an entire planet. But the strangest part of the story isn't that the lie survived, it's how it evolved. Because when fear grows old, it puts on new clothes. The same powers that once called the plant the devil's weed began selling its fragments in glass bottles, labeled wellness. They rebranded ancient rituals as luxury lifestyles. The sacred leaf, stripped of its spirit, came back as a product. CBD oils, hemp lotions, mindfulness teas, the new sacraments of a civilization that forgot their roots. What was once outlawed in the name of purity was now sanctified in the name of profit. And for the first time in history, the priests of this new religion weren't bishops or politicians. They were marketers. But let's rewind for a moment. The shift didn't happen overnight. It began quietly, in laboratories and hospitals, in the stories of patients whom science could no longer ignore. Epileptic children who stopped seizing after a few drops of cannabis oil. Cancer patients who could finally eat and sleep again. Veterans who found peace from trauma in a plant they were once jailed for touching. Their stories forced the world to look again at what it had condemned. And for the first time since the age of shamans, the sacred leaf was spoken of with compassion, not fear. Then came the corporations. When they saw hope, they saw money. In the 2000s, pharmaceutical giants began isolating compounds, THC, CBD, CBG, turning nature into patents. The same governments that had banned cannabis for a century quietly approved synthetic versions made in labs. The irony was biblical. You could go to prison for growing a plant, but you could sell its molecules for millions if you wore a suit. Behind the scenes, the propaganda simply changed tone. Instead of calling cannabis evil, they called it dangerous without regulation. Instead of demonizing users, they targeted small growers. The old cross became a barcode. Control remained the goal. Only the language evolved. Meanwhile, culture moved faster than law. Documentaries, doctors, and data began breaking through the wall of silence. People realized that the war on drugs had never been about drugs. It had been about obedience, race, and money. In 2012, Colorado and Washington legalized cannabis for recreational use, a decision that stunned the world. Politicians warned of chaos. Churches predicted moral collapse. And yet, the opposite happened. Crime dropped. Tax revenue soared. And the forbidden leaf became the backbone of a billion-dollar industry. But even as legalization spread, the spirit of the plant remained divided. For some it was liberation, a symbol of truth rediscovered. For others, it became just another brand, polished, packaged, and sold in shiny dispensaries. The mystics had always said the plant was a teacher. Now, it was just inventory. The same hands that once held torches now held marketing budgets. And once again, humanity found a way to turn wisdom into product. Still, deep beneath the algorithms and slogans, a quieter movement was taking shape. Not about profit, not about politics, but about remembering. People began exploring the plant the way their ancestors had, in silence, in meditation, in search of something more than escape. In small circles, in deserts, forests, and mountain retreats, they burned the leaf as incense. Not for pleasure, but for connection. The same smoke that once filled Scythian tents and Sufi shrines rose again, this time with laptops and playlists beside it. Different tools, same longing. Because technology can give you information, but only silence gives you meaning. And here lies the paradox of the modern age. We live in a world where cannabis is both medicine and crime, both miracle and merchandise. The same governments that taxed the plant now own its patents. The same nations that jailed people for smoking it now export it as medical relief. It's as if the Church of Control never truly fell. It just built new cathedrals, made of glass and data. We no longer confess to priests. We confess to algorithms. We no longer burn witches. We cancel heretics. And the same question echoes through the centuries. Who decides what's sacred? And who decides what's forbidden? In every age, power rebrands itself. The church once said, "Obey or burn." The state said, "Obey or be punished." Now the market says, "Obey or disappear." But the smoke still rises, stubborn, ancient, unrepentant. Because you can regulate a substance, but you can't regulate awakening. As cannabis re-enters the world stage, it carries with it a warning and a gift. The warning that every freedom can be sold back to you in a prettier box. The gift that connection, true connection, cannot be owned. The sacred and the forbidden have always been two sides of the same leaf, and we are the ones who decide which side we see. The world thinks the story of cannabis is about getting high. But the truth runs deeper. It's about memory, of what humanity once knew and was taught to forget. That nature isn't against us, that the divine doesn't need permission, that liberation can grow quietly in the soil beneath our feet. And yet, the story isn't over. Because while the world reawakens to the leaf's healing, another force is already shaping its future. A digital empire built not on faith or fear, but on data. And in that empire, the same question that haunted the church still remains. Can a mind truly be free if every choice is being watched? The 21st century began with a promise of freedom. No kings, no priests, no inquisitions, only screens, voices, and infinite choice. But look closer, and you'll see the same old pattern hiding behind the light. The church once owned your soul. The empire owned your body. Now the algorithm owns your attention. And that, in the end, may be the most perfect form of control humanity has ever invented. The war on cannabis never truly ended. It simply migrated online. Now it's not about banning smoke. It's about defining it. Companies sell you relaxation in perfect doses. Apps tell you when to breathe. Influencers sell you serenity like priests once sold salvation. You no longer need a temple to find peace. You just need a subscription. What began as rebellion became a brand. And what was once the symbol of inner freedom is now the logo of lifestyle capitalism. But deep down, the plant still remembers. It remembers the shamans who sang to the stars, the slaves who prayed through the smoke, the poets who dreamed of freedom between coughs. It remembers what humans keep trying to forget, that liberation never comes from permission. That's why, no matter how many laws or ads or filters are placed on it, the leaf keeps finding its way back to the same hands, the dreamers, the healers, the outcasts. Because cannabis was never just a drug. It was a mirror. It showed humanity what it was running from, itself. The modern world claims to have outgrown superstition. We say we've replaced faith with reason, incense with science. But in truth, we've only changed the symbols. We don't kneel before altars anymore. We kneel before screens. We don't confess our sins to priests. We post them for strangers to forgive. And the same instinct to control, to label, to condemn, still drives the machine. Yet amid all the noise, a quiet rebellion is growing again. Not in cathedrals, not in protests, but in small moments of honesty. A young woman breathing under moonlight after years of anxiety. An old man in pain, finally able to rest. A soldier closing his eyes and finding silence after nightmares. No marketing campaign could invent that. No algorithm can understand it. That's not consumption. That's communion. Maybe that's why the story of cannabis refuses to die. Because it's the story of remembering. Remembering that the divine isn't locked in books or governments or screens. It's in the breath. It's in the heartbeat. It's in the small act of saying, "I choose my own peace." That's what terrified the church. That's what threatened empires. That's what still unnerves the modern machine. Because a person who finds peace without permission is impossible to control. Look around the world now. Legalization spreading, minds opening. Stories once whispered now shouted aloud. It feels like progress, and in many ways it is. But remember what every age has taught. Power doesn't vanish, it adapts. The church built cathedrals of stone. The state built prisons of law. And the market built prisons of desire. Each one promised salvation. Each one sold it back for a price. The sacred smoke rises again, but this time it curls between the circuits of the machine. It seeps into documentaries, art, science, music, the last ghost of something that refused to die. It whispers the same ancient message that terrified empires and still echoes through time. You are not born to obey. You are born to awaken. In the end, the story of cannabis isn't really about a plant. It's about humanity's oldest addiction, the addiction to control. And the cure, as it always was, is the courage to breathe, to feel, to think for yourself. So if you're listening to this now, take a moment. Inhale. Exhale. You've just performed the oldest ritual on earth, the one every empire tried to own. And for that single breath, you are free.